Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl, and welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt. What if the greatest freedom we could ever find isn't out there in the world, but right here, within us? What if the keys to resilience, clarity, connection and calm were already in our hands if only we could remember how to use them? Today, I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Dr. Emma Seppälä, clinical psychologist, researcher, and author of the powerful new book, Sovereign: Reclaim Your Freedom, Energy, and Power in a Time of Distraction, Uncertainty, and Chaos. Emma invites us to consider what it means to reclaim our inner sovereignty in a world that so often feels like it's pulling us in 100 directions, from self-criticism and emotional suppression to digital overload and disconnection. Sovereign offers science-backed and soul-nourishing ways to come home to ourselves. We'll explore the bound state, the sovereign self, and the daily practices that can help us live with more presence, authenticity, and compassion. And so I bring you Dr. Emma Seppälä. Dr. Emma Seppälä, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Thank you, Stan.
I did want to show you that I have this one, The Happiness Trap. 2016, which actually is a beautiful sort of science communication book. It pulls all together the science of happiness in a really beautiful and very digestible kind of a way. I also have this one, the Oxford Handbook of Compassion Science, 2017. So I'm a bit of a fan. But today I was really keen to talk about your latest book, Sovereign, which I've obviously got on Kindle. I'm trying to reduce the number of books on my shelf there. But I wondered if we could start with the title of your new book, Sovereign. So what do you mean by sovereignty?
Well, I didn't see a term in psychology that I could use to characterize a way of living that is more free internally. You know, we talk about a lot of things in psychology, but we don't really talk about freedom. We don't really talk about how to be disentangled from the many thought patterns and behaviors that keep us in a restricted way of living. For example, you know, I teach executives. That's what I do at the Yale School of Management. And I see these really talented individuals. And then whenever I ask, you know, how many of you are self-critical, 95% of the room raise their hand. And we know that self-criticism is a form of self-loathing in psychology, and that it actually leads to more anxiety, depression, fear of failure, lack of willingness to try again, like the opposite of resilience. So you know this, you're familiar with this literature. This is just one example, right? So most people are running around with this program in their head of self-loathing, and it is standing in their way. So there are many examples I can point to with regard to sovereignty, but this is just one example of how a way of thinking, a way of interacting with oneself is standing in the way of our greatest potential. So sovereignty is both the awareness of what's in the way and the courage and strength to move through that and no longer let it bind you so that you can show up at your fullest and best, you know. And I think, especially if we think of it as, for example, if we were parents, or, you know, do we want our child to be able to show up as their fullest, best, most courageous, most expressed self? Yes, we do. And that is everyone's birthright. That's sovereignty.
So freedom and kind of it's partly an internal freedom in terms of
it is internal freedom. Yeah, I don't really talk about external freedom in the book. It really is about internal, because you could have external freedom. So many of us live in more or less free countries, but are still bound by these sort of internal programs that are standing in our own way. Sovereignty is seeing them and then being able to liberate yourself from them. And that's what that's what I attempt to do in this book, which chapter by chapter walks you through gaining sovereignty over your relationship with yourself, over your emotions, relationships, etc.
Mm. Yeah, I guess you introduced the idea of the bound state. So that's sort of what you're really talking about here.
Yeah.
Self-criticism is an example of that. Can you talk some more about this bound state and how people kind of tend to get stuck there?
I mean, it really is, if we're really honest with ourselves, there are certain areas in our life where we don't feel expanded, where we feel constricted. It could be a relationship, it could be um, a way that we're approaching life. For example, I share the story of a really amazing executive that came through our program. Her name is Star, and she was wrestling with this idea of that she needed to be safe. So she learned along the way that she needed to be safe. So she was in this government job because of fear. She just stayed there, but she was clearly able to do so much more. She's an extremely talented person. And she realized, wow, as a Black woman living in America, I felt like I always have to stay safe. So, but there was a part of her that was yearning to expand into a bigger potential. And so she stared that belief system down and faced her fears, and went and applied for jobs outside of the government, which she was immediately got, some really great options. And she faced that fear, and now she's a high level executive in a really great company, and because she faced that fear. So she was bound by this sort of fear state, by this belief that she had to be safe. And then when she was able, she says it really beautifully. She says you have to stare that thing in the face, it's not the truth, and then she moved through it. And yeah, so sovereignty does involve courage, but I think you know what do we want to do? Do we want to live the life that we don't actually want to live and
Mm.
stay safe? Or do we want to be courageous and live the life that we were born to live? So many people on their deathbed regret not living the life they wanted to live. The majority of people. Let's not be one of those.
Yes, freedom and expansion. I really like both of those words. They're really
Yeah.
great sort of descriptions of sovereignty in a sense, and the fear
Mm-hmm.
that might keep us bound. And it reminds me a little bit of the difference between safety, which might be more restrictive and that seeking safety and therefore not venturing out, versus safeness, where we feel we have the strength and courage and we feel kind of safe to venture out in a sense. And it's any thoughts there between, I mean, I know it's semantics in a way, but sort of safety versus safeness?
Well, if your life is characterized by fear, you're bound, right? You're restricted. Now, there may be things you have to be careful of course,
Yeah.
but how many of us are restricted, constricted by fear when we'd actually love to be doing something else? Maybe we're in a relationship that's not healthy because of fear and we don't want to leave. Maybe we're in a job because of fear. Maybe we are not going for those things that we really want to do because of fear. I mean, I for myself was so afraid of public speaking until my mid-20s. I mean, really deathly afraid. And I had a mentor who told me, go and teach. And he said, your specialty is teaching. And I was like, what is he talking about? But I listened and I went. And now I do public speaking for a living and I love it, But had I stayed in my fear, I would never have known that I love public speaking, and it allows me to share things that I love.
Yeah, it's that sort of, it's the fear, it's the threat system, it's the fight flight responding, it's all of
Yeah.
those things that kind of
Yeah.
keep us bound. And it's actually interesting really because when we have that bound state in that internal sense, it does actually have an effect on our freedom externally in a way, not in that political sense or social sense
Yeah.
necessarily, but just
Yeah.
in terms of the restrictions it might place on us in the our aspirations or goals or the things that we'd
Yes.
really, like to achieve, and we feel kind of bound and stuck, and yeah, this is really about sort of reclaiming the sovereignty over that, and the choice, I suppose, and so on.
Yeah. And that's where awareness is so key, because so many of us are bound in ways that we're not even aware of. And so that awareness is really key. And I point to the need for us to practice things like a meditation, because that allows us to have that self-awareness. For example, most people, when they're feeling negative emotions, what do? Most of us have learned to suppress it, right? So, but then what do most people do? They're like, I don't know how to feel. What do I do? I don't like feeling bad. I don't like feeling sad. I don't like feeling mad. I don't like feeling depressed. Okay, so what am I going to do? Most people will eat or drink or scroll or binge or porn or shop or overwork or overexercise. I can look very saintly, but it's all a way to not feel. Right. And that's something we're so afraid of feeling bad. And yet those habits, those behaviors keep us stuck, and they keep us imprisoned in a way. And most people are doing this without realizing, oh, I feel bad. Let me just scroll. Let me just go on YouTube. But actually what the research shows is that when we do that, when we suppress the emotion or try to escape it somehow, we actually end up feeling just as bad afterwards, only more beat up by our drug of choice. Right. And so what we know from emotion research is that, by suppressing emotion or trying to distract ourselves constantly, we actually maintain the emotion over time. And it doesn't serve us in any way. And sovereignty is the courage to actually feel what we're feeling, which takes a lot of courage in this world that's full of distractions that can make us feel other things or taste other things or whatever, in order to, because the only way out is through, right? Not that you want to wallow in your sorrow forever and ever, but allowing the emotion, which we know is energy and motion, to move through our system. That's like a child. Like a child is angry for 5 minutes, really, really mad, and then they're not angry. Why? Because they let it move through their system. Not that we should be yelling at people or anything, but being aware and present with what is right now, what is the emotion, and allowing it to take its course. It's just energy moving. Whether you write a song out of your sorrow or you whatever it is, move the energy in some way. But our society is one of distraction and of pleasure, and that can actually keep us bound and unhealed, if that makes sense. There's another way. It's sovereign. That's why sovereignty requires both awareness and it requires courage. When I was 17, 18 in college, the way I would cope with feeling bad was I would binge eat. And I was stuck. It was like an addiction. I couldn't help it. It was so compulsive. And then one day I went to a meditation session because I had a crush on somebody who was going there. And I didn't really want to do the meditation because it just seemed really strange to do that in the 90s. It was just like a weird thing. And I went because I wanted to meet this person. And I ended up sitting through this hour-long meditation, first meditation of my life, staring at the floor with little to no instructions. It was very strict, and it felt really, really not fun for a 19-year-old. And I left the event thinking, I feel really calm, but I'm never doing this again. It was torture. And the next day I felt bad again. I was feeling low because I often felt low in college at the time. And I went in my dorm room and there was this disgusting looking pizza. And I thought, great, I can binge. But then this light bulb went off in my head, and the light bulb said, you always cry after you binge. Why don't you cry first? That awareness had never dawned on me before, ever. And I thought, okay, I can do this. Yeah, let's go. So I went and cried on my bed. And when I was done and I sat up, I was shocked to find out that I no longer wanted to binge. And I'd never binged again after that. And so that what I'm pointing to is the awareness. And, one meditation session, one 60-minute session had created enough awareness for me to free myself from this addictive, destructive behavior in 24 hours. Not to say that will happen for everyone. But what I'm saying is practices like meditation, and I highly always recommend it, by creating awareness, make you free from what you're otherwise trapped in.
Yeah, there's a really strong focus in the book on sort of emotional authenticity to be able to be aware of and to sort of notice and understand and kind of be present with one's emotions. We spend so
Yeah.
much time and effort avoiding emotions, don't we? We have a discomfort or a fear, really,
Yeah,
of those difficult emotions, but
it's true.
we stay. It really keeps us stuck and bound. That effort to avoid. You mentioned meditation there. One of the things I did want to ask you about is you've done some research around breathing in particular as a practice to
Mhm.
sort of work with those sorts of difficult emotions. The work you've done with veterans and so on. What tell us a little bit about those studies.
Yeah. I mean, it really started in New York City during 9/11. I mean, I was in New
Mm,
York at the time and I saw the second building uh, get hit. And after that day, I had a lot of anxiety, really, really strong anxiety. Every morning at 8:30, my body would shake. And I really was trying to figure out a way to help myself stabilize. And I didn't want to go the medication route. So I was trying all sorts of things. And, meditation actually that at that time was very hard for me because when you're very anxious, to sit and meditate is just makes you more aware of your anxiety. I mean, it was just,
mm.
especially when you have high anxiety, it's not a good first step. I didn't know what to do. And so finally I walked into this breathing class called Art of Living, which is, originated in India. And I thought, what is this? Like, this is ridiculous. Like, how is this going to help me? But I stuck through the class. Actually, actually, no, the first class I left. I was like, this isn't going to help me. But then and
Ah.
I tried it again the second time. I was like, I didn't finish the first class. So I finished the second one. And the instructors were like, do this for 40 days and then see and learn a technique called sky breath meditation. And I thought, yeah, I will do this for 40 days because I don't believe you. I mean, I'm scientist mind. I just skeptical about things, very skeptical. And after 40 days, I never stopped. It's what, 20 years later, 20 something years later. And it helped me so much and not just curb my anxiety, but become more centered again, be able to succeed in my work and my grad school. Everything sort of started falling in place when my internal state fell in place. And so, I've continued that as a personal practice. I finished my psychology PhD at Stanford, and I did research on meditation, another form of meditation called loving kindness meditation. And then 10 years later, I was working with veterans with trauma. And my colleagues were trying meditation interventions with them, but the veterans were dropping out. And I said, yeah, I know why. When you have really high anxiety, then meditation is not a good first step. In fact, it's really uncomfortable. And I thought, let's see if we can help them with the breathing that I had learned. And there's a nonprofit called Project Welcome Home Troops that teaches the sky breath meditation to veterans at no cost. And I partnered with them, and we ended up running several studies. And what the research showed was that the veterans, after learning the practice, many of them no longer qualified as having post-traumatic stress. They were able to move on, sleep again, succeed in their life and their relationships. And we even compared it to the gold standard for post-traumatic stress, the cognitive processing therapy.
Mm.
And it was at least at least the same, if not better than that, in terms of when you look at the brain, emotion regulation, the breathing was actually more potent. So it's really interesting. And I think one of the reasons is that a lot of the practices that we're introduced to in therapy or even in meditation are cognitive. They're just very at the level of the mind. Whereas with breathing, you're going right into the nervous system and triggering the parasympathetic, calming the nervous system. Um, and the sky breath meditation in particular is a protocol. It's like a 20-minute protocol that is very specific kind of sequence. And it seems to be very effective. Right now, everybody's a breathwork master all of a sudden on Instagram. And,
Oh.
everybody's like teaching. But, the yogic practices said that some of those breathing practices were for warriors to go to war. So they're going to make you more activated. And then others are to help meditation and more peaceful. And then there's a specific kinds of breathing that do different things. Um, so anyway, but the sky breath meditation is one that I'm still using, and it's taught again through that nonprofit Art of Living, which is out of India, started in India, based in yogic practices. But it's been wonderful. We've done research at Yale University as well with the undergrads, and we found that compared to all the other well-being practices that we studied, that the breathing was the most successful. Again, I think it's because you're addressing the nervous system as well as the mind, not just the mind, because we know when there's a lot of anxiety or a lot of mental activity, if you're trying to calm down by telling yourself to calm down, that doesn't work. Never in the history of calm down has anyone ever calmed down by being told to calm down, right? Like it works if you're just a little upset, but if you're very high strung, it doesn't always work.
Mm. I'm sure there's not always an exact sequence to sovereignty, but I feel like breathing is sort of one of the foundational bits in a way, because it does help to create that sense of calm, which aids in both the awareness and the courage in a sense. And so it sort of helps us along the way.
It's so true. I wish everyone had this. Every child had this. My 10-year-old has learned there's a kids program for this sky breathing. He does it every morning with me. I just want them to. I wish I learned it at 24, and I was like, where was this when I was 12? Wouldn't it be nice if we all learned this in school? That would be my dream. That would be my goal. If I could help make that happen through research, I would really love that.
I really appreciate how in a couple of those personal anecdotes, they begin with a reluctance there for you. That your stories of they sort of describe a kind of a sense of, oh, this seems silly or sort of kind of uncomfortable in some way, and there's that kind of that reluctance or reservation or even kind of leaving early maybe with the breathing sort of a thing. It's sort of a important reminder, isn't it, that it does take courage. It takes a kind of a wherewithal, a sort of a willingness to try something new, even if it feels a little bit strange.
Yeah, and an openness. And I think I was
Openness.
not very open. I thought I was open, I was open in my intellectually, but I wasn't really. But then
Mm,
life teaches you, doesn't it? You just crack
mm,
open more and more, and then you're like, oh wow. I think it's so interesting as scientists, to get trapped in this idea of knowing it all.
mm,
It's like actually no, like science shows us we don't know most things, but it's just so easy. I feel like in psychology too, I know I was in a lab that studied emotion regulation, and this whole idea was, well, you can only kind of regulate your emotions through your thinking. And that's just, not the case. When emotions are very strong, we know that the fight or flight is activated, and you actually have loss of prefrontal regulation, which is why it's so hard to talk a child out of a tantrum, but the same with an adult, we don't have access to our full logical capabilities.
mm, mm.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It's almost like we can end up a bit bound by our knowing,
Yeah,
the sort of.
so true. We can, and that's why it was interesting in grad school in psychology, and you probably, yeah, I'm sure are very aware of this as well. There were these paradigm shifts. It's like
Ah,
all of a sudden things shift, and then paradigm shifts, and then paradigm shift, and then you start thinking about things differently. And I really think when I was in grad school, they were like, you don't want to be pigeonholed as a meditation researcher. You don't want to be pigeonholed as a breathing researcher. Nobody does that. And now everybody's doing it, and it's like, well,
yeah.
we can't stay stuck here. In psychology, I feel like academics are so in their head that that's or not, I should say, like psychology researchers are so intellectual that they approach the solution as needing to be intellectual. It's like, actually, like for the veterans, they didn't need to be told, hey, you don't have to brace yourself in front of the mall before going in, there's no danger. They already know that.
Mm,
But their body is responding with needing to brace themselves for 20 minutes before they can walk into a crowded place. There's no
mm,
problem with their intellect, but the trauma memory was still there. And that's so physiological.
mm,
So I'm really glad we're moving more towards
mm,
physiological approaches in
mm.
addition, as a
In addition,
complement.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, it's interesting that paradigm shifts are created by people who are sovereign in a way, because they,
Yeah.
to make that shift, to sort of lead the charge in a sense with something new
Yeah.
that's unknown and especially different, and maybe even going a little bit against the tide, that there needs to be that sovereignty for that person, the
Yeah.
openness, the expansiveness, the freedom to do
Yeah.
that. And then often others, start to follow along behind.
Yeah. And that's scary. It's
Mm.
scary because people may criticize you. It's interesting because
Mm.
the first story I share in the book is about missing a keynote event that I was scheduled for and forgetting about it. And that we had planned for 6 months. And I know, and a fellow academic, she read that chapter and she said, "Are you sure you want to share this? Because no one will ever hire you for a keynote again." And I thought, that's interesting. You're in the old paradigm. The old paradigm. I didn't say this to her, but where we just need to always look perfect all the time. We're not human.
Mm.
We're perfect. It's like, I was like, and for me, I felt, for my readers, I'm not going to be pretend to be something better than I am. Like, no, we're all just humans. And that paradigm is not working for anybody. The perfect paradigm. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And but it
absolutely.
was interesting because she was in that paradigm and she was like, "Are you sure?" Because I share a lot of vulnerable and also kind of
Yeah.
ridiculous stories in the book. I wanted people to laugh and have a good time too.
Yes.
But it was interesting to see that because I was like, well, I guess I'm out of that paradigm. Like it was a little scary to 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 write the book, but then I thought, this is going to help people. So what the hell, right?
Mm. Yeah, there's something actually kind of freeing in being able to
Yeah.
share or express, or our,
Yeah.
our self-criticism and shame really lurks in the dark, hidden places, doesn't it? But
Yeah.
to sort of share is sometimes actually, it helps with feeling free.
Yeah, so true. And we're all human and we all have difficult times, embarrassing times, scary times. Like
Mm.
that's where we connect. It's so interesting. Like, how do we connect with another human most deeply? It's when we're able to be vulnerable with each other, when we're
Mm.
able to be real. And this world right now that we live in of, often facade and make believe, and
Mm.
it's not real. It's pretty on the surface, but nobody's really feeling that deeper connection.
Mm.
So I wish,
Mm.
if we look at kids, it's like we want them to, they're free when they're little, they're still free. And then you're like, just stay like that. Don't change.
Yes.
And so many adults wish they were free again, like a kid.
The wisdom of babes, isn't it? Being they can teach us so much really in
Yeah.
these. Actually, in terms of being real, I mean, you talk about aligning with our sort of natural rhythms and that sort of thing. Can you sort of elaborate on there? We get
Yeah.
disconnected
So
and yeah, what does
disconnected.
reclaiming that look like?
But it's interesting because we kind of think about nature as this like nice place that you can go to sometimes, like when you go to the movies sometimes. We don't realize that we are nature. Like we were born, what, 6, 7 pounds, and then
Mm.
our whole body is made up of nature. Like we are a part of it, and yet we live like we're not. On screens all the time, up way past when we should be going to sleep. Eating whatever garbage that our ancestors wouldn't even have recognized as food, and then wondering why we feel off. No sunlight. I know it's just living in a room, like it doesn't actually make sense. I mean, some of it we have to do right for our work, etc. But um,
Yes.
research shows that when we're more aligned, when we spend more time in nature, when we are eating food that is more like more fruits and vegetables type of food, our mental health goes from what the mental health is of someone who is out of work to someone who has work. I mean, the contrast is dramatic.
Mm.
The basics of like being outside, eating healthy and sleeping enough and aligning ourselves with what all the other animals on the planet, sometimes the domestic animals have been sort of corrupted by our or made more artificial, but the rest of the natural world is living according to rhythms and respecting them. And as a consequence, they can thrive, right? So it's so
Mm.
interesting to me. I had this thought, while I was writing the book, it's like we're so fascinated with extraterrestrials, but we didn't. We haven't realized that we're extraterrestrial in the sense that we're living on the earth, but we're no longer of it.
Oh,
You know what I mean?
yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And then we wonder, why do I feel so off?
Mm,
Why do I have mental health issues? Why do I have physical health issues? We've
mm,
completely, and then of course we do ignore nature and we abuse her as well, right? So we're paying the price in many ways.
mm,
So sovereignty is being aware of that, reclaiming that, and then so that you can reclaim your physical and mental health as well. Um,
mm.
yeah, I
Yes, we're
mean,
sort
not
of,
that we can be off screens, we can't be off screens totally and so forth, but just being aware, like, have I gone outside today? Have I seen the sun? Like, am I going to bed at a normal, reasonable hour? Like, we know between 10 and 2 is when you're getting, your greatest rest and restoration for your body. Like, just things like that.
mm.
Eating healthy, not eating anything that is your ancestors wouldn't have recognized as food. Think about it. They wouldn't even have, they'd be like, what is that?
Mm. Yeah, sort of realigning with the natural rhythms within, but sort of the rhythm of life in a sense, and
Yes,
being able to
it is.
reconnect with that, and being outside and being just recognizing again our oneness with nature, really,
Yes.
and going with it rather than fighting against it all the time.
And there's so much data on that. I mean, there's there's no one marketing the benefits of nature on our well-being or the benefits of fruits and vegetables on our mental health. We know about physical health, but not mental health. How many people are medicating for their mental health, but eating crap, It's like,
Mm,
well, why don't we try to shift how we're eating, how we're sleeping, and whether we're spending time outside? Why isn't that the first order of priority when we're addressing people's mental health and well-being? It should be, right?
mm,
Because
mm,
maybe once all that's in order and once the rhythms are in order, the circadian rhythm is in order, maybe we'll be feeling better, you know?
mm. Yeah. I mean, relationships too are central, I guess, to being human.
Yeah.
What does it mean to cultivate sovereign relationships?
Mm-hmm. I think so, relationships is a really tricky area for most people, just navigating that. And oftentimes we'll blame others for, I remember in grad school, for example, there was one professor who kept losing her grad students. They would leave, they would quit, they would go to another lab. And when the seventh person left, this professor was still saying, oh, blaming the grad students. Like, at what point do you wonder how much of this have you created yourself? Right. So, a bound way of going through relationships is constantly blaming the world and never looking at yourself. Now, it takes two to tango, and sometimes, there's issues on both sides, and sometimes it's the issue is in the other side. That's for sure. But awareness is also understanding how much of my own fears, of my own challenges, am I facing here in the relationship, and how much of that relationship is actually a mirror for me, and maybe the mirror is saying respect yourself more and leave the relationship, but maybe the mirror is also saying you have a problem with trust, and you're with a trustworthy person. Now go heal that problem that you have with trust, you know so that's just one example of regaining that sovereignty of our relationships, because they're a
Mm,
source of great suffering for many people, both joy
mm,
and suffering, right?
yeah.
Whether it's relationships with your loved ones or your workplace. um
Mm,
yeah, and again, it's always that game of awareness. That I have a formula for sovereignty. It's like awareness plus courage plus a full tank. We haven't talked about that much yet, but that full tank. When do we show up at our worst? It's usually when we're drained and exhausted and burnt out and stressed. When do we show up at our best, which is really who we are, is when we have been able to fill our tank. Now, in our current lifestyle, it's hard to fill the tank oftentimes. And that's why it's so important to think about, like, how do I spend the few moments I have for myself every day? Am I spending it draining my energy on scrolling through my phone or watching a show I don't even enjoy? Or am I replenishing myself with meditation or with sleep or with doing an act of kindness for someone, as you know so well, Stan, is an act of compassion that will both uplift the other and myself. So am I giving my body what it needs to sustain itself, etc.?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's sort of who am I in this moment? What am I in this moment? Where am I in this moment? That sort of sense of really trying to notice
Yeah.
oneself. Relationships are an interesting example of that, where the relationship and the other person's responding becomes a bit of a mirror to ourselves. But there's
Yeah.
in any given moment, we're wanting to try to bring that awareness to mind, having the courage to take steps, but keeping one eye on the tank. Is it full, or
Yes.
or is it kind of
Yeah.
on red or something like that?
If you're on red and you're about to face your screaming children, everybody's going to suffer, right? And if you're on red and you can tell your partner, I'm on red right now, I'm going to have to step out. I have to
Mm,
take some deep breaths. I'll let you
mm,
handle this for now, right? Or even like, kids, just play for a few minutes. Mama will be back once I'm done, when I
mm.
filled my tank.
Yeah, when I fill my tank. Yes, communication and boundaries, and those are just so key, aren't they, in terms of having sovereign
Yeah.
relationships,
And
boundaries
forgiveness.
and
Mhm.
forgiveness.
Yeah, because research shows that when you forgive others, it actually frees you. It's a gift
Yeah.
you give to yourself, Um, and when we harbor grudges, it actually is like a burden on us. And the data even shows that once you go through forgiveness exercise, you literally jump higher. Like physically, your body is moving
Oh.
higher. This
Mm,
idea of just, often when we hold on to anger or resentment, it actually weighs us down.
mm. Yeah,
Mm.
definitely. You mentioned compassion and self-compassion. That's another area that you've written extensively about. Um, and it's interesting because in some ways, compassion is a sensitivity to suffering and a commitment to take action to alleviate. I guess there's parallels there a little bit with sovereignty.
No, absolutely. I mean, research shows, as you know so well, Stan, that the greatest secret to happiness really is compassion. I mean, and that's again something nobody's marketing to us because no one's going to make money off of us spending more time in nature, eating more fruits and vegetables, and being compassionate and kind. But it's
Yes.
it's yeah. If I were to summarize the science of
Yeah.
happiness in one sentence, it's that the people who live the happiest lives, but also the longest and healthiest lives, because it's a byproduct, are the ones who live a life characterized by compassion, balanced with self-compassion. So, when what the research shows is when we uplift others, it not only benefits them and society, but it benefits us and it re-energizes us. So it's a beautiful thing. And of course, you have to balance it with self-compassion. And we all know people who are altruistic to a fault and then burn themselves out. That's not helpful. Balance with self-compassion, which is filling your tank, but also having a life supportive relationship with yourself where you're there for yourself. So that that full tank idea. Um, and I wish everybody knew this.
Mm.
That's why I wrote the book in a way. I just wish
Yeah.
everybody knew this because that's what the
Yeah.
science shows, isn't it, Stan?
Yeah. Yes, we so often unwittingly walk around in a bound state. Fear,
Yeah.
vulnerability, self-criticism, as you said, self-loathing, all whirling around, highly defended, sort of not taking the steps that we really aspire to. And sovereignty is
Yeah.
really about bringing awareness,
Yeah.
finding the courage, finding the energy and filling the tank, but to sort of take a step towards freedom and expansion and openness and kind of healthy mind and healthy body.
Yeah. So true. Stan, you said it.
Well, Emma Seppälä, thank you very much for writing the book. It's a delightful, and it is, there are some very moving bits, but also the humor that runs through it. So thank you for that, and thank you for speaking with me on compassion in a t-shirt.
Well, thank you for reading and sharing this message. And I really feel like the book came to me. I don't really feel like I authored it. I feel like it came as this inspiration to help people. And so I just took the challenge. I was like, okay, I'll write you. And I'm just really delighted when people can really see it, hear it, and share it. So thank you, Stan.
Beautiful. Thank you very much.